ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the East Room. Actually, this is the exact replica of the East Room that's in the White House, just a slight bit larger. Now, before I introduce our guest speaker this morning, I would like you to please rise and join me in saying the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, and please be seated. First of all, I would like to welcome 3 schools that we have with us here today. We have Sarah Catholic. We have West Covina Christian School. And we have Abiding Savior Lutheran. I would also like to thank all of you for joining us today in this next event of our 9/11 series of events. Now, this morning's guest speaker is Colonel Wayne Scott, a retired colonel from the United States Air Force. Colonel Scott served on active duty as a communications officer for over 29 years. Retired in 2005, and guess what? He came back to his home state of California. Now, during his military career, Colonel Scott's family lived all over the U.S. and in Europe. He served on 2 war campaigns: Operation Allied Force, the defense of Kosovo in 1999, Operation Enduring Freedom, as well as the global war on terrorism. Since his retirement, Colonel Scott has worked for Thales Raytheon Systems in Fullerton, and he still helps provide communications and computer systems for our military. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Colonel Wayne Scott.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to begin by thanking the Richard Nixon Foundation for giving me this opportunity to be part of this week's events commemorating the 10th anniversary of the attacks on 9/11 and giving me the opportunity to share the military's response to the events of that day. I'm honored to have my parents joining us this morning, and while the MC specifically threatened me to mention anything about our relationship, I will tell you it's more than a coincidence that we have the same last name. As Cindy stated during her introduction, I served over 29 years in the United States Air Force, retiring in late 2005. It was my distinct honor to serve alongside the men and women who wear the uniform of our country and responded to defend our freedoms and our way of life after the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001. I will start by stating that I did not see combat in Iraq or Afghanistan, although I did deploy to that theater of operations, serving in the Combined Air Operations Center, or CAOC, in Saudi Arabia in 2002 during Operation Enduring Freedom. But before the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And while many have stepped forward with great courage to carry the battle to our enemies, both on 9/11 and in the years since, my focus this morning will be on how the military responded, both during the attacks and in their immediate aftermath. I will pause briefly to, Cindy, recognize the 3 schools that are here. How many of you here this morning are 13 or younger? I will tell all of you, thank you, I will tell all of you that I'm really aiming my comments more at you, because you were preschoolers, toddlers, maybe younger at the time of these attacks. And it's something that you have read about and heard about. A lot of us have very vivid memories of that day that are seared in our consciences forever. But really what I'd like to do is, more than anything else, is make sure that those of you students that are here today really grasp what we went through that day and immediately after. To truly understand the military's response to the events of September 11th, 2001, we must first understand the military's posture for defending American skies on September 10th. I will initially focus on air defenses, since that was the nature of the attacks on that infamous day. All branches of our military, Army, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard, and Air Force, were actively engaged in our nation's defense that day, at home and abroad, although none of us anticipated an attack like the one that occurred. The plan for defending U.S. skies in September 2001 was based on a threat from the Cold War with the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, our concern was an attack from those Soviet forces based on intercontinental ballistic missiles and air-manned bombers flying to strike targets in our country. As a result, our radars and our defenses were all focused outward, over the seas and lands bordering our nation. If those radars picked up any unidentified aircraft, the jet fighters would be launched to intercept and identify those aircraft and shoot them down if they were deemed hostile. So when the sun rose on September 11th, this is what the military radar coverage for the U.S. air defense looked like. To complicate matters, the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, was operating under rules that assumed that all aircraft operating within U.S. airspace were cooperative, that is, actively broadcasting their location and identity. Most of you have seen radar dishes before, but you may not know there are actually two systems operating here. The large dish below is the primary radar and operates the way you think. It sends out a beam of electronic energy which bounces off of an aircraft and returns to give a radar blip of where that aircraft is located. However, above the main dish, here, is a secondary radar, a system which broadcasts a radio signal which interrogates a radio on board the aircraft, called a transponder, and the transponder then replies with various information about the aircraft, including its identity, its altitude, and other data. A pilot can even set the transponder on his aircraft to squawk certain codes to indicate an emergency, a hijack, or a communications failure. Since the FAA was assuming all aircraft would be cooperative, they had stopped maintaining the primary radars, the main dish, and were relying exclusively on the secondary radar signals to control U.S. airspace. So the combined effect on September 11th was that neither the military nor the FAA was prepared to track hostile aircraft within U.S. airspace that day. The military was focused on a threat coming from outside our borders, and the FAA was controlling aircraft that expected to be cooperative. When the terrorists hijacked the aircraft that morning, the first thing they did was to turn off the aircraft transponders. As a result, the FAA immediately lost track of those aircraft. Their normal response was to first attempt to contact the pilot by radio, but of course, the terrorists did not answer. Based on an overheard radio transmission, the FAA assumed that American Flight 11 had been hijacked and contacted NORAD's Northeast Air Defense Sector asking for fighter support. If you look at this map, you can see that the red path was where this aircraft was supposed to be headed. At around the point here in central Massachusetts is where the terrorists turned off the transponder and diverted off path. In response, fighters from the Otis Air National Guard Base on Cape Cod, shown right out here in the right center of the screen, were launched, although at the time the exact location of the hijacked aircraft was unknown, again because the transponder was off. Then at 8:46 a.m., the first aircraft, American Flight 11, crashed into the World Trade Center North Tower. At the same time, the fighters from Otis Air National Guard Base were launching. However, at this point, the connection between the hijacking and the World Trade Center crash were unknown. That morning, I was at work at Langley Air Force Base near Hampton, Virginia, assigned to the staff of Air Force's Air Combat Command. I was discussing with some of my staff the progress on a software program we were developing when one of my master sergeants came to me and said, "We just heard on the radio that an aircraft crashed into the World Trade Center. Can we turn on the TV in your office?" I agreed and continued on in my conversation. When I went to my office a few minutes later, I was expecting to find a foggy New York sky with a small private aircraft having crashed into the building in the fog. I had seen, try that again. I had seen photos of similar events in the past. This is actually a photograph of the Empire State Building in 1945 when a B-25 bomber had in fact crashed into the 79th floor of that building in the fog. So I was surprised to see instead a bright, sunny, clear day and a very large hole in the side of the building with smoke pouring out. As we discussed what may have happened, a second aircraft, United Flight 175, flew into the picture and crashed into the South Tower. 9:03 a.m. It's a moment I will never forget. This is actually a television screenshot. This is exactly what I was watching live on television at the time that it happened. After standing in stunned silence for a few seconds, I turned to my staff and said what I'm sure many said when they saw the same events that day. We are at war. Start locking everything down. I expected we would soon be elevated to ThreatCon Delta, the highest state of preparedness to defend against hostile attacks at military installations worldwide. Sure enough, the direction to implement ThreatCon Delta came a short time later. There's a famous term used by the military, coined by 19th century Prussian military analyst Karl von Clausewitz. It's called the fog of war. It refers to the uncertainty faced by participants in military operations when information is incomplete, not understood, or sometimes completely wrong. In the early hours of the attacks, the fog of war loomed very large. Reports came in that 3 commercial aircraft were squawking the emergency code, a car bomb had exploded in downtown Washington, D.C., and a light aircraft had crashed near Camp David. We now know that those reports were false, but all had to be investigated for possible military response. It wasn't until American Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon at 9:37, still less than 1 hour after the first attack, that the extent of the threat began to become clear. My office at Langley Air Force Base was built inside a hangar, and I remember hearing 2 F-16 fighters take off with full afterburner, which allowed them to accelerate to Mach 1, faster than the speed of sound in mere seconds. The historical timeline shows that those fighters launched at 9:24 a.m., just minutes before the Pentagon crash. I didn't know it at the time, but those aircraft were launched to defend the skies over our nation's capital. Among the first flights in what would become Operation Noble Eagle, the name given to military operations related to Homeland Security following September 11th. The fighters that had launched from Otis Air National Guard Base about 35 minutes earlier were also directed to assume Combat Air Patrol, or CAP mission, over New York City. As the severity of the threat and the crashes became known, jet fighters were launched from several bases to respond, although how to respond was not well defined. Some fighters were launched to intercept hijacked aircraft, but the fighters were unarmed. Others were armed, but had no instructions for what actions were allowed, what we call rules of engagement, or ROE. While our military maintains a high state of readiness to respond to attacks against our nation and its citizens, there were no rules in place for something like this. Soon after the ROE were put in place, and Air Force and Air National Guard pilots have flown well over 55,000 missions in support of Operation Noble Eagle in the past 10 years. We should note here that when American Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon, all 59 on board were killed. I personally refused to include the terrorists in my numbers, as well as 125 in the building, the Pentagon, including 55 uniformed military personnel. While part of the building collapsed, and the ensuing fire raged well into the next day. Military and civilian personnel in the National Military Command Center, the NMCC, in the Pentagon, remained at their posts, directing military responses and collecting and reporting valuable information. Refusing to let the terror attack prevent them from completing their assigned duties. This is even when smoke was floating into the room through the air conditioning ducts and the fire alarm was blaring the words, "Evacuate the building." It is at times like this we see the true character of the men and women who have sworn to protect our freedoms with their very lives. While all of this was unfolding, the military was also exercising its role in helping to protect the president. President Bush had flown to Sarasota, Florida on Air Force One the day before to promote his proposed education bill. Shortly after learning of the second plane crash into the World Trade Center, President Bush's party departed for Sarasota Airport and boarded Air Force One. Air Force One took off and climbed very rapidly, an effort aimed at moving the president out of harm's way as quickly as possible. It was during this flight that President Bush authorized U.S. military pilots to shoot down any civilian airliners that were confirmed hijacked and threatening either the White House or the Capitol. The phrase, "weapons free," is one a combat pilot expects in a war zone, but not in the skies over America. And yet that is exactly the authorization President Bush provided. Fighter pilots launched in response to the attacks, including the two I had heard take off from Langley Air Force Base, had been given permission to shoot down civilian airliners full of American citizens if the situation required it. A frightening prospect, and thankfully, one that has never been exercised. When Air Force One took off from Sarasota, the plane was to return to Washington, D.C. But with one aircraft already crashed in the Pentagon and warnings of a threat against Air Force One, the decision was made to fly the president to Barksdale Air Force Base near Shreveport, Louisiana, for protection. Fighter escorts and the Air National Guard soon joined Air Force One to provide additional protection. After taking a brief speech to the nation while at Barksdale, Air Force One again took off, this time headed for Offutt Air Force Base near Omaha, Nebraska, again with fighter escort, where President Bush was moved to an underground command center built by the military to withstand a nuclear blast. Through all of these flights and stops, President Bush was in constant contact with the Vice President Cheney, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, CIA Director Kemp, and other key personnel, gathering important information and making decisions about how to respond to the events and threats. All of this is possible because of the incredible suite of communications technology which travels with the president wherever he goes. This advanced technology is provided by a military organization called the White House Communications Agency. At the time, this agency was under the command of a fellow Air Force colonel friend of mine. So by 3 p.m. on September 11th, President Bush was being safeguarded at Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska. Military from all services were already supporting recovery actions at the Pentagon. Joint Forces Command in Norfolk, Virginia, was already sending headquarters units to New York and Washington to direct military support to the areas attacked. One of the things that was implemented, and Vice President Cheney talked about it here last night, was our government's plan for continuity of government. And as part of that continuity of government measure, they launched the National Airborne Operations Center, or NAOP, the 747 you see here. It's a converted 747 equipped with advanced communications technology intended to direct military operations during and after a major attack on America. It was a capability many thought would never be used once the Cold War ended. And we had U.S. fighter aircraft patrolling the skies over New York, Washington, D.C., and other major cities, all under the control of Airborne Warning and Control, or AWACS aircraft. The entire American military was at Threatcon Delta and prepared to respond to further attacks if necessary. In his book, Eyes on the Horizon, Air Force General Richard Myers, who was at the time Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, writes of leaving the Pentagon that night, with his uniform smelling like smoke. Instead of hearing the sound of commercial jets approaching and departing Washington National Airport, only a few miles away, he heard the sound of military jet engines, fighter aircraft flying combat air patrol over our nation's capital. General Myers aptly described this as the sound of a nation at war. But the military response did not end on September 11th. In fact, that is when it started. When President Bush returned to the White House later that evening, he insisted on Air Force One returning him to the Capitol where he could fulfill his duties as Commander-in-Chief. Planning for a military response was already underway. In meeting with the National Security Council on September 12th, the President referred to the events of 9/11 as an act of war and told his staff that the full power of the United States, civil and military, would be devoted to the goal of hunting down and destroying the enemy that had perpetrated these acts. On September 14th, Congress authorized the President to use all necessary and appropriate force against those responsible for the attacks. And on September 15th, the response strategy began taking place. This is only 4 days after the attack. A simultaneous diplomatic and military approach was approved by the President on September 18th. And United States Central Command, led by Army General Tommy Franks, had now official authority to proceed with planning a military option. This operation would require access to military installations in some countries with which we had no military relations, although other allies in the region, notably the United Arab Emirates, Kyrgyzstan, Oman, Bahrain, had already agreed to provide support for any operation against Al-Qaeda. On September 20th, President Bush addressed a joint session of Congress that was televised to the entire world, where he demanded the Taliban regime surrender all the leaders of Al-Qaeda or, quote, share in their fate. The next day, General Franks from CENTCOM briefed the President and Vice President on the four-phase military operation he and his staff envisioned. My time here does not allow for describing that plan in detail. You can read about it in several books. But it involved naval, ground, air, and special operations forces staging from several nations in the region, as well as ships in the Arabian Sea. Basing arrangements and targeting moved ahead in late September. Planning a major military operation like this quickly was a monumental task. By early October, forces were moving in place to support operations. Long-range Air Force V-2 bombers in Missouri were loaded with precision munitions. Navy cruise missile ships were in place in the Arabian Sea, and Army Special Forces were on the way to Karshi-Khanabad Air Base in Uzbekistan, a place we all came to refer to simply as K2. We learned the names of countries and cities and locations during that first 30 days that many of us didn't even know existed before. On Sunday, October 7th, General Franks reported that all the forces were in place and he was ready to execute the plan. So shortly after sunset in Afghanistan that day, October 7th, Operation Enduring Freedom began, only 26 days after the 9/11 attacks. By comparison, planning for Operation Desert Storm air campaign in 1991 took 5 months. And the ground campaign there started a month after that. Eventually, we would have U.S. forces operating from K2 in Uzbekistan, Manats Air Base in Kyrgyzstan, Jacobabad Air Base in Pakistan, in addition to ships in the Arabian Sea, other nations in the region, and eventually from within Afghanistan itself. But Enduring Freedom was not just about striking our enemies. It was also about helping the Afghan people overcome years of oppression by the Taliban. In this OEF campaign map from October 9th, you can see several sites targeted for military attack, marked by the triangles, but you can also see where the U.S. military dropped humanitarian assistance that same day. Within 2 hours of the first bombs falling on October 7th, Air Force C-17 cargo aircraft from Ramstein Air Base in Germany dropped 35,000 daily ration packs in northern Afghanistan. That mission lasted 22 hours and the aircraft traveled 6,500 miles. These drops continued through December of 2001 and included 2.4 million daily ration packs, in addition to wheat, blankets, cold weather gear dropped to displaced refugees throughout Afghanistan. While the focus of the military response for the 9/11 attacks was now taking the war to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan, the military was also fully engaged in security here at home. During our tour in Germany, one thing that amazed me was the presence of armed military personnel patrolling airports and train stations. I remember thinking in awe that they had to use their military for transportation security. But when I took my first air flight after the 9/11 attacks, I saw the same thing right here in America. At the request of the President, the state governors activated several National Guard units to provide a visible deterrent at our nation's airports. Armed soldiers patrolling American airports with loaded automatic weapons, something I thought I would never see in America. Yet none of us complained. We readily accepted this strong military presence, visibly communicating that such attacks would not occur again. In addition to this visible deterrent, immediately after 9/11, the Air Force began working diligently with the FAA to improve visibility and control of aircraft flying in U.S. airspace. Within 6 months, all of the FAA primary radars had been returned to full operation, and all of them had been connected to the NORAD air defense centers. So, if you remember the previous chart, military radar coverage a short time later now looked like this. In addition, radios operating on military frequencies were installed at all FAA communication sites, and this allowed senior leaders to talk directly to fighter pilots involved in intercepting any hijacked aircraft, something required by the new rules of engagement. To process the information being received from all these newly connected radars and radios, the operator consoles at the air defense sectors had to be replaced. On 9/11, they were using the old Cold War equipment that's shown on the left. Some of it dates to the 1960s. And it was replaced by the graphical computer-based capability that you see on the right. And this is something that actually my company developed and delivered to the Air Force in response to this event. As for my personal involvement in the 9/11 response, one of my first tasks turned out to be very, very interesting. You're probably familiar with this. Shortly after we began combat operations in Afghanistan, we began flying Predator drones over the area to observe enemy forces, identify likely targets, and even locate refugees for food drops. The problem was that the operations centers that needed to watch and review the live Predator video were located in Saudi Arabia and Florida. So how do you launch an unmanned aircraft from Pakistan, fly over Afghanistan, and let people watch the video live halfway around the world? Well, that's simple. That's why we have satellites, right? Well, guess how many of them? This diagram shows you what my team put together. It involved 5 satellites, 6 satellite terminals on the ground at 4 different locations, and a lot of high-speed circuits. When we finished, and we did all this in just a few weeks, we were flying the Predator via a satellite because the mountains blocked the signal between the ground station in Afghanistan and the aircraft flying over, the ground control station in Pakistan and the aircraft flying in Afghanistan. We were sending the Air Operations Center in Saudi Arabia could watch the video live via another satellite link. The intel people back in the States could receive the video for analysis. That was after hopping the signal through a satellite terminal in Germany. And the CENTCOM staff in Florida could watch the video live. And the AOC in Saudi Arabia had a backup feed where they came back to them from the States, since they were often making decisions without striking targets in near real time. They couldn't afford to have a circuit go down. My boss would later describe this capability as being the situational awareness tool of choice in Afghanistan, and it is still something I am very proud to have accomplished. After completing this project, I was asked to get involved with another Predator communications link, this one supporting a mission which was still highly classified at the time. In 2001, the CIA was working a special project to arm Predator drones with Hellfire missiles, Hellfire air-to-surface missiles, and that program was accelerated for completion after the attacks on 9/11. Well, this is something you read about in the news routinely today. It was anything but routine in 2001. Several of the same sites we connected to review the live predator video now had to also view video from another set of armed predators, and that video had to come over classified circuits. While the CIA put the initial connectivity in place, the video quality was not sufficient to make weapons launch decisions, so I was asked to bring my team in to help. I very distinctly remember one night working in a computer equipment room in a classified vault in Virginia. I had with me 2 video technicians who couldn't even be told what the circuit was for, just to make it better. As they worked, I was on the phone with an officer in Saudi Arabia who was saying, "Okay, that's better. Okay, yeah, that's better too. Oh, no, go back. And finally, wait, that's it." Well, I'm sure they have made changes to what my team installed in the past 10 years. Predator surveillance and armed predator strikes have been a key part of our military success in Afghanistan, and I still have the military challenge coin I was presented for my work on that project. Well, I could go on about the military's actions in support of Operation Enduring Freedom, Noble Eagle, and Homeland Security. I will end with a description of the price your military has paid to defend our nation through these and other operations the past 10 years. On September 11th, 2,977 were killed. 246 passengers on the 4 aircraft and crew. 2,606 in and around the World Trade Center, and 125 in the Pentagon, including 55 uniformed military. Since that time, 6,170 Americans, military and civilian, have lost their lives in Iraq and Afghanistan, and another 45,621 have been wounded. This does not include losses from the many nations who have fought alongside us in these efforts, nor the many civilians in these countries who have been victims of the fighting that raged around them. Every one of them was a son, a daughter, a husband, a wife, a brother, or a sister. Some in this room may have lost a loved one in this ongoing struggle. It is a high price to pay, both in blood and treasure. Yet, while some may try, we cannot put a price on freedom. Nearly all who have fought and sacrificed in these campaigns understood the price they might pay, yet went willingly out of their love for America and adherence to the oath they swore when they joined the United States military. I will close with a quote from John Stuart Mill, a 19th century English economist and philosopher. "War is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things. The decayed and degraded state of moral and patriotic feeling which thinks that nothing is worth war is much worse. The person who has nothing for which he is willing to fight, nothing which is more important than his own personal safety, is a miserable creature and has no chance of being free unless made and kept so by the exertions of better man than himself." I count it an honor to stand before you today and relate but a small portion of what those better men and women accomplished in response to the attacks on our nation nearly 10 years ago. Like the many first responders who stepped to the forefront when our nation was attacked, our military deserves our respect, our honor, and our profound thanks. In closing, I would like to share a brief invocation given in 2008 by a chaplain of Special Operations Forces, one included in Vice President Dick Cheney's new book, In My Time, and one he shared from this platform just last night. "We are soldiers, God, agents of correction. May our world see the power of faith. May our nation know the strength of selfless service. And may our enemies continue to taste the inescapable force of freedom." Thank you. you all. I accept that not for myself, but on behalf of the men and women who wear the uniform of the United States military. I think we have just a few minutes to take some questions, if anybody has
We
any.
will take some questions from the students, a couple of questions from the students, and a couple of questions from the adults. So if you'll raise your hand, I'll come over, just state your name and then your question. Do any of you have any questions? Okay, let me come right back to you over there.
I'm Anita Miller, and I wanted to know if the attack on 9/11 was as hard as it sounds.
Was what?
Was the attack on 9/11 as harsh as it sounds?
It was, absolutely. It's interesting, in several in my generation couldn't quite grasp our parents always telling us. I mean, my mom and dad are here. They were basically around the age that several of you are when we had the surprise attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And an event like that shocks an individual and shocks a nation. And it changes who we are. And it changes the way we see the world around us. And so, while the loss of life that day was horrible and tragic, 3,000, the way that it has changed the character of our nation, the way it has affected our relationship with other nations in the world, has been very, very significant. It changed the world. It changed who we are. In some cases, it changed us for the better. There was a large increase in the number of young men and women who volunteered to join the military in the aftermath of 9/11 because they took the attacks of that day very personally and wanted to be part of our nation's response. And so, yes, it was very, very harsh, and it is something that those of us who lived through it will carry with us until the day we die. Good question.
Another question?
So then there's somebody behind.
Would you have one over here?
Somebody back there?
Okay, let me get this one up here.
I'm Gabriel Barra, and were there any terrorist attacks before 9/11?
Were there any terrorist attacks before 9/11? Yes, there were. There have been several. Those who have studied in detail, there's a lot of discussion about when did the attacks by these extremists and Al-Qaeda actually begin. There was an attack against the World Trade Center in 1995. There were attacks against U.S. embassies in Africa in 1996. There was an attack against the USS Col in Yemen that I believe was in 1998. And so while the reason the attacks of 9/11 are seared in us and are so significant to us is because those attacks happened here. I mean, the attack on the World Trade Center in 1995 also happened here, but the loss of life was very, very small. That it was an attempt by Al-Qaeda, the same organization, and their intent was to try to take down the World Trade Center in 1995. So yes, there have been a series of attacks. They go all the way back to attacks against the U.S. Marine compound in Beirut, Lebanon in 1983. And there have been a whole series of them since that time.
You have a question? Here we go.
My name's Emily, and since the United States killed Osama bin Laden, do you think there'll be another attack?
I wish I could attribute this quote properly, but there's a great quote that says, diligence is the eternal price of freedom. While Osama bin Laden and his organization were certainly responsible for the 9/11 attacks and attacks before and in other parts of the world since, and while we have had great success in removing a large number of the Al-Qaeda senior leadership, there are a lot of people that are still sworn to and dedicated to our destruction. And so while removing bin Laden was certainly a great military success, and certainly I think a lot for those of us who lived through it probably was seen as a great act of retribution for what happened on 9/11, there's no way we can let down our guard and assume that there isn't somebody at least still planning another attack, and we have to be prepared for it.
I'll take one more student question, then we'll take a couple of adults. Any other in this group right here? Okay, let me go ahead and take you.
Did everyone get burned? Is that how they died? Or?
I'm sorry, there were, in the attacks, there were, let me try to go one by one. At the World Trade Center, and actually I learned this just the other day, there are still over 1,500 people for which they have never found any remains at all. So when you have something the size of a World Trade Center collapse, releases a tremendous amount of energy. There were ensuing fires. While some of the victims were recovered, many were not. There still are today some that survived with injuries, including burns, that I'm sure will be speaking about their experiences that day in the days ahead. But yes, some perished as a result of fire, some were burned as a result of those fires and survived, but some have been lost forever, never to be found again.
A question over here? Okay, sir.
First of all, let me be the first if anybody's asked questions. So thank you for your service. If you would be kind enough to take a moment to explain the effect that 9/11 has had on the military's planning for warfare. 9/11's changed the face of the enemy. We're no longer facing the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc as we had in the Cold War. The rogue nations are the new face of our enemy, along with an emerging China. But could you talk about how the military has faced that challenge and what, to your ability, you can speak to how we're dealing with that?
Certainly, excellent question. Up to through the entire Cold War, the military structure, training, weapon systems were all based on what we call a force on force. In other words, there's going to be a large U.S. military fighting against a large Soviet military, a large NATO military fighting against a large Eastern Bloc, Communist Bloc military, largely what you think of in terms of like World War II, large military formations maneuvering in a field trying to control territory. The nature of the threats today is more what we refer to as asymmetric warfare, which means my enemy structure is not anything like my own. And so as a result, that's why you see the special ops forces, for example, being very widely used and being highly successful, because a small team that can move rapidly with light weapons is more effective against that elusive, non-state terrorist kind of a force. While training used to be, how do I maneuver artillery and armor and infantry forces in the field. Now a lot of training is more based on an urban warfare. How do I go into an area full of buildings and clear out bad guys without harming the people who live there? So the way that we train, the way that we execute those forces, the way that we move those forces around in small teams rather than large units. I mean, we don't. Yes, in Afghanistan and Iraq, we've had entire army divisions in place there, but they move forward as that, but they're really employed more in small combat teams. So I think that's probably the biggest difference that I would address is how we employ the forces, how the forces are structured in response to that, and how we train them.
Another question over here. Okay, ma'am.
During the attack of Afghanistan, when the humanitarian aid packages were dropped, how did the military make sure that didn't get back to Taliban members to help them?
A good question, and it was not difficult, and frankly, some of those probably did. But again, through special ops and even CIA operations forces on the ground in Afghanistan, through the use of the predators, the predator drones that I talked about earlier, is that we tried as much as possible to make sure that those supplies were going to refugees that had been displaced as a result of the fighting or as a result of the harshness of the Taliban regime. And as much as possible, trying to stay away from areas that we knew were still under Taliban control. So did some of them end up falling into the hands of those we were fighting against? Probably. We did drop 2.4 million. So that some of them would end up in the hands of the adversaries is probably a distinct possibility. But a lot of effort going into making sure we were locating where were the people who most needed those supplies. And you'd be amazed how precisely we can airdrop humanitarian aid in that kind of a situation. And I mentioned the 2 aircraft being the first ones in only 2 hours after the first bomb. There were hundreds of aircraft, and oh, by the way, not just American. We actually had some of our allies. I read an account where the Soviets actually, the Russians, used aircraft. They were not prepared to drop the items into Afghanistan, but they flew their aircraft loaded with supplies to the air bases that we were operating out of in, in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, so that those supplies could be loaded on our aircraft for drop into Afghanistan. So it wasn't just American, I think the world behind that as well.
I will take one last question, and before I do that, I just want to mention that the students will exit the back doors there, and you will go row by row. There will be a docent that will guide you over there, and the rest of the public can exit the main doors. So I just want to mention that so that you're prepared to exit these doors row by row. So sir, right here.
My name is Gary from Brea, and would Flight 93 have been shot down had they not crashed in Pennsylvania?
It's a hypothetical, but I can tell you I have read accounts that there in fact was an Air National Guard aircraft that had been sent in the direction of that flight. Again, with the transponders off, would the individual have located it? The Northeast Air Defense Sector of NORAD was actually not even advised that United 93 had been hijacked until after it had crashed. So that there was an aircraft that was unknown, it was lost, they had a general idea of where it was, and so there was a fighter aircraft that was dispatched to intercept United 93. Given the instructions that came from the president that day, if that individual encountered the aircraft, it was non-responsive and still believed to be a threat, Yes, under the ROE, the individual would have shot the aircraft down. It's a hypothetical, it's a good question, but that was the difficulty that day, is that the rules of engagement were literally being developed on the fly because we were facing threats that we'd never faced before. And I heard an individual within the past week talking about that, a lot of the Air National Guard pilots, their full-time job is airline pilots. And you very well might have had an Air National Guard pilot flying a fighter interceptor going up against an aircraft, a civilian aircraft that belonged to the airline that he worked for, maybe with a pilot on board that he knew. I'm really thankful it never came to that. But the instructions that day was, if confirmed hijacked and believed to be a threat, shoot it down.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank Colonel Scott for joining us today in the